All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get squared away here. We left off yesterday talking about mobilizing for war, and like it or not, one of the great things about war is that war brings about all kinds of new technology. Like I said, yeah, and it's wonderful for an economy. We see this very clearly numerous times throughout American history, including World War II, which is actually what ends the Great Depression. All right, those of you that are still talking, I'm going to ask you to stop because I'm having to talk a lot louder than is comfortable for me to do. Okay, so we left off talking about like rifling. All of these things make life much more accurate. And although we're still using gentlemen's warfare, we're seeing much more smaller skirmishes, not like big, huge, massive battles. That's not to say that there aren't big, huge, massive battles, because there are. Gettysburg, Antietam, there are some massive battles. Does that make sense? But we're going to see a lot of little, small skirmishes that come and go.
Okay, so if we're using gentleman's warfare, and Lincoln had to fire a lot of generals, how did the generals mess it up? If all they have to do is get the soldiers to stand up and stand in a nice, pretty line and shoot at the enemy, how does one mess that up?
Well, we shall get into that, I promise, okay? I don't want to spoil things as we're going through, but we will talk about that as we get more into the actual battles themselves. The other things that we're going to see, new sort of technology that are going to help shape this, is the greater implication and implementation of the railroad and the steamship in order to bring supplies to the front lines, the use of the telegraph to allow communication to the front lines, which, I mean, in our modern world, it's nothing to think about picking up a phone or shooting a text message or whatever to somebody, but the idea of being able to almost instantaneously communicate a message across hundreds of miles is revolutionary, especially when it comes to warfare. Because prior to that, how do you communicate a message? Via horse, via messenger, right? So what happens if that message is intercepted?
Too bad, too sad.
Too bad, too sad. It may totally screw everything up for you. Does that make sense? Or if the person dies along the way, or whatever else, right? So, I mean, just to have that ability to have that more instant, not quite instant, but a little bit more instant communication and easier communication will change how the war is fought.
So would this be like the U.S.'s first industrialized war, or would that be more towards the 1900s?
We can, in some senses, call it the U.S.'s first industrialized war because of the use of the railroad, the use of the steamship, the use of more modern communication technologies such as the telegraph. Does that make sense? Although there are some that still argue that that really doesn't come around until World War I because of the fact that World War I will change how we fight war. Does that make sense? And it's not until World War I that we really see an end to gentleman-style warfare. Very simply because of the machine gun, and it is no longer smart to try to fight gentleman-style warfare. Not that it's really smart during the course of the Civil War because of rifling, but we kind of haven't figured that out entirely yet. Does that make sense? Which is why part of the reason why the Civil War is so stinking bloody. What's that? Yeah, you know, I mean, we haven't figured all of these things out, so we'll get there. But the other really cool thing about the Civil War is that we're going to see a revolution in our Navy and in our ships. Prior to this time, everything that we have predominantly are wooden ships, which are fine until you're really seeing the development of cannons and the use of cannons everywhere. Does that make sense? Both on land and those cannons on land being able to reach ships and aim in ships back and forth, right? And so it just doesn't simply work. When we look at then the ironclads, the first engagement of the ironclads will be on March of 1862. We have the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Monitor, both of them, FYI, were Union ships. Does that make sense? Okay. But the Merrimack, which was formerly the USS Virginia, when Virginia leaves, they take the USS Virginia with them and rename it the CSS Merrimack. Does that make sense? Okay. But it was the former USS Virginia. So it was already there, and they already had it. Now, because of the Merrimack and because of the ironclad Merrimack, the Union has to develop something that's counter to it. Okay? Otherwise, if Virginia hadn't left, they would have had the superior naval vessel. But with the Merrimack going to the Confederacy, the Virginia going to the Confederacy, they now have to do something in return. So the Monitor is actually built in a mere 100 days. It is much smaller and faster than the Merrimack is. It also has some things that are kind of a little bit more beneficial than the Merrimack as well. In fact, the Monitor has the first revolving gun placed on a ship. So it was actually an 11 gun basically in one that would revolve around a center point, which then allowed them to shoot basically in any direction, which today doesn't seem that revolutionary, but at the time was insanely revolutionary. This idea of being able to mount a very large gun, move it with ease, and shoot at any angle towards any potential enemy. And so that was really, really cool at the time. The other thing that we'll begin to see the development of as well, in addition to the Monitor and the Merrimack, is we will see the development of ships that are based and utilized predominantly within the river systems. These ships have a much smaller draft. You guys know what I mean by the draft of a ship or a boat? Yeah, so right, here's your water line. Ships based on the weight of their ship, the ship itself will, based on the buoyancy and ballast and right, of a ship, will put the ship in the water, right? Okay, and it will determine how much of the ship is actually submerged below water. The heavier the ship, the lower it goes typically. Does that make sense? But with the ironclad ships got heavier and heavier because you're taking in typically older wooden ships, and you're cladding them with iron. Hence why they're called the ironclads. Does that make sense? Okay. But iron is very heavy, so that's going to pull the ship lower in the water. Well, in the open ocean, it's not such a big deal, right? Because you got plenty of down to the bottom, right? You got plenty of space there. You don't have to worry about it running aground. But in the river systems, those type of ships aren't going to work because they're going to have too much underneath the surface of the water. What do we got?
Thank you.
James. Okay, that's all right. So it's just simply not going to work. So instead, we wind up developing these much smaller gunboats that not only had less above the surface, but also had less below the surface as well. Okay, they're much lighter ships. They were faster, easier maneuverable, and even though some of them were still ironclad, because they maintain a smaller size this way, does that make sense? Their bottom side is not so deep, which then means it's not only quicker, but it's not going to run aground in a narrow river system, which with the Anaconda plan is absolutely critical. That makes sense? Okay, so we're going to see the development of that new technology as well within the smaller ships for that piece there. When it comes to financing the war, both will kind of take a different method, but in ways somewhat similar as well. For the Confederacy will sell over $400 million in Confederate bonds, both at home and to countries abroad as well. This is one of the ways in which they garner money. Now keep in mind, those 400 million CSS notes, they're worth nothing. Once the war is over, they are worth nothing. So it was a huge gamble for both foreign entities as well as Confederate entities to bank on the fact that they would actually get paid back on those treasury notes. Well, the Confederacy loses, There goes that $400 million. Nobody gets any return on that investment. Does that make sense? Another way that they do this is they increase taxes. In particular, they will increase taxes on farm products by more than 10%. And the biggest way in which the Confederacy makes money in order to finance the war is they simply print money. Okay? They will print over $1 billion in Confederate notes. But there's nothing to back those Confederate notes, and since there's no massive gold or silver coming from Western states into the Confederacy, it means rampant inflation. In fact, inflation in the Confederacy is so rampant that it's literally like 9,000%. Okay?
Where would they spend this money?
Where are they spending the money? They have to spend the money with Great Britain in order to buy the products necessary to fight the war.
So Britain's getting like this fake money and they're like,
Well, I mean, at the time it wasn't fake money.
but Britain's like, oh, this
But
is
I
good,
mean,
real.
like,
It's not worth anything.
it's not worth anything, and when the war's over, it's, I mean,
Really not worth it.
really not worth anything.
Did the Union have to pay off that debt after the war?
No.
Okay.
Kind of forgiven.
It's dissolved.
It's pretty much dissolved, because Confederacy doesn't exist anymore.
In Great Britain as well.
Now, some of the states, the individual states, had debt, which the federal government will assume some of the states' individual debt, but notes and bonds paid out from the Confederacy, that is simply just money that is gone. It doesn't, like, it has no value anymore, okay? They'll also do what's called a tax-in-kind program. This is where you're being taxed on products that are exchanging hands. So, like, for example, if I am bartering product with you, I would still have to pay a tax on that product that we're bartering. So even if I'm not actually exchanging in a currency notes, I would have to do that. Now, obviously, this is not real, but this was given to me by a former student who went down to Georgia over spring break one year. Gabby Hansen gave these to me. So you can take a look at them if you would like. But that's basically what they look like. And pretty much the same kind of texture of the Confederacy notes as well, okay? For the Union will raise some money using war bonds, but they will also pass the Legal Tender Act, which gives us about 13%. 1862, basically, it allows us to print and allow us to create about $450 million in what we call greenbacks. This is why, and the direct reason why our currency today is still green. Now, it doesn't mean that prior to 1862 we didn't have currency that was like green in color, but we had currency that was green, that was red, there was all sorts of different colors. There was no standardization of what the U.S. currency looked like. Post-Civil War, the standard color becomes green, until the modern day, in which now we are seeing our currency have much more different colors into our currency as a direct way to try to prevent counterfeiting. Does that make sense? Okay? And make it more difficult to counterfeit money. Sometimes I look at some of the new notes and I'm like, this doesn't even look real. It looks funny, but it is, okay? In addition to that, we'll see in the first time ever for U.S. history, the passage of an income tax in 1861. It is a temporary income tax. It is not permanent. Permanent income tax does not come into play until don't quote me on this, it's either 06 or 16. Somebody who has a computer, look it up, please. It's as a result of the passage of the 16th Amendment. Because according to the Constitution, you could not tax an individual private citizen's income. Does that make sense? The state could tax income, but the federal government could not. So in order to gain that, we have to see a passage of an amendment for a permanent solution. Does that make sense? This is in one way in which we see the Union actually go around the Constitution in order to fulfill the ideas of being able to actually fight the war. Does that make sense there, guys? Okay. In addition, we will see the passage of the National Banking Act. This again helps to unify currency within the United States and will ultimately last until 1913 when it is replaced by the Federal Reserve, which we still have today. Okay, so that's kind of where that comes from. For the Union, the vast majority of the financing of the war, unlike the Confederacy, which actually comes from printing notes, the vast majority of funding for the Union comes from income tax. In fact, 2/3 of the funding of the war will come from an income tax. And as a direct result of that, we will see that inflation for the North, although it is still crazy high, it is only 80% in comparison to the 9,000% of that of the Confederacy. Okay, 80% FYI is insane. The average, what we see, what is considered like normal inflation, because inflation's a constant all the time, is about 2%. That's where we like it to be. Does that make sense? So anything more than that is too high. If you think 2% is our normal, like that we're good with, 80% is insane.
So like if milk costs like $3.30, like 80% inflation, what would it be then?
I don't know. I'm not a math person. I can't do that in my head.
Like
Okay.
$6, $5.
Really?
Yeah.
Summer
Yeah,
camp.
pretty much $5 a gallon.
I don't know. I can't do the math in my head, so I'm sorry. But in addition to that, the union will also pass an excise tax specifically on tobacco as well as in alcohol. It's not the first time that we'll see a tax like this on a specific product. In fact, during the course of World War I as well, we will also see part of the reason why prohibition is passed is because of trying to limit the production of alcohol as a way to help win the war. So, and it's also a good part of the reason why prohibition is overturned in 1935. So we see these kinds of things be put in place kind of frequently when it comes to alcohol and tobacco in general. Okay. In addition to that, we will also see the passage of the Morrill Tariff Land Grant, which again is responsible for the creation of what? The Morrill Tariff Land Grant, what?
National parks.
No.
North Dakota State Museum.
Yeah, NDSU, all agricultural colleges, but this land grant actually also helps to bring greater monetary funds into the union as well, because they are able to produce products at a much higher rate because of the research that is being done in those colleges, and then that extra product is sold off as well. So here you can just see these are some examples of our greenbacks, and you've already seen some of the Confederates.
Okay, so who are the people on the Confederates? Like, Jefferson Davis is one of them.
Davis is on there. If I remember correctly, Lee is on there. But other than that, I'd have to do more research to know for sure.
Is there a reason there's no backside to those?
Why? Because there wasn't. It costs more money to print on two sides.
No one had like printers at home, so it wasn't like that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like you could like easily counterfeit currency because it's not like people had home printers. So, I mean, you weren't worried about trying to prevent it from being counterfeited. Does that make sense? But to print like if you were to print currency on two sides, okay, you're printing on one side, you're waiting, delaying until it like completely dried, and then you have to print on the second side. The printing on two sides costs more, not only because it takes longer, but also it's more ink. Does that make sense?
Everything was scissors.
And everything is like, yeah, it's not hand cut, but it's machine cut, but not machine cut like we think of today.
Like one of them, like chopper things.
Kind of.
So like an old lady and they're cutting it, it's like getting crooked.
And sometimes, if you look at really, really old, even U.S. currency, a lot of times there's misprints and misstamps of currency. You can actually buy like currency that is like not correct, but most of the time, like the U.S. Mint, even today, there's some that don't go through correctly. Most of the time, the U.S. Mint actually pulls it out of circulation or prevents it from ever even going into circulation. So if you have a circulated note that is a misprinted note or like a coin that is stamped incorrectly, like it's off, it's actually that's circulated is actually worth quite a bit of money because they don't like those being circulated. Does that make sense?
Caught with it, I think they're fake.
What's that?
You get caught with it and they're like, where'd you get this?
Not necessarily, but maybe, but generally no. I mean, you can have them authenticated, so
It's like
that's
at work,
the
you
thing.
always have to like see if there's a
And generally people don't, it happens most frequently with coin, and most people don't try to counterfeit coin.
But you think they would, because that'd be like the easiest
No,
You gotta get the right measurements of the metal and then just stamp it out.
yeah.
But you have to get the metal melt down the metal.
It's much more difficult to
Otherwise,
counterfeit that,
You can't
okay?
make paper.
All right, so the South, in large portion, also as a way to finance the war, will attempt to implement King Cotton. Prior to the course of the war, 75% of Great Britain's exports of cotton was actually from the South. But unfortunately, and by 1860 as well, it's about 57.5 of U.S. exports is cotton. So the South really believes that that will be their key way of helping to pay for the war itself. But unfortunately, this doesn't really work out for them as well as they would hoped, because quite frankly, we're able to create enough of a blockade that the South is not able to get enough of their cotton out. Also because the South really doesn't have a very good navy, it required Great Britain to pretty much come and get the cotton and take it back, which for some people in Great Britain was just simply not enough of like a reason for that. But it's because of the South's cotton that it kind of creates that relationship with Great Britain from the beginning. But despite that, Great Britain has other sources of cotton. They don't have to rely on the American South for that cotton. In particular, they have access to cotton through India, and that provides them an additional resource. So the cotton surplus also that existed in Great Britain in 1861 also makes it much more difficult for the South to sell that cotton to Great Britain and thus make enough money to actually fuel the war in the way that they believed that it would. Okay. In fact, it's part of the reason why the South has to produce so many treasury notes is because the cotton doesn't become the currency that they hoped it ultimately would become, okay? When it comes to diplomacies, we see that actually initially France, Britain, and Austria-Hungary all support the Confederacy. Russia is the only exception. Russia does not support the Confederacy. It supports the Union. And there's a reason why most of these places will support the Confederacy. This idea of a democracy succeeding and surviving is something that is very much problematic to any kind of monarchy. Why?
Because it inspires their people.
Yeah, it inspires other revolutions, right? And our American Revolution has already inspired other revolutions. So these countries would like to see and have a vested interest to see the United States fail as a democracy, as this massive union. And so many of them will sell weapons and supplies to the Confederacy as well as warships. In one case in particular, there is what's called the Trent Affair. We'll talk about that in a couple slides here.
Wait, why is France with the Confederacy?
Why is France with the Confederacy? Because of the fact that France, although they are anti-slave, France believes very much in the idea of the people having greater self-determination. It's part of the reason why France has its revolution in the first place. And so the Confederacy having this ideal of this self-determination, being able to determine how they would run their own individual state is very appealing to France, because they believe that's how they should be able to run their individual parishes. Does that make sense? Which are like their counties, states that we have. Does that make sense? Okay, the opposite. So, ultimately, Britain will become very, very close to joining the war. What prevents Britain from joining the war, quite frankly, is that signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit, okay? I feel like I've kind of talked about a lot of this. Ultimately, the biggest reason why the Emancipation Proclamation, guys, ends that is because if we look at slavery, Great Britain outlaws slavery in 1833, France in 1794, in France proper, and then in French colonies by 1802, and Austria-Hungary will outlaw slavery in 1843. So that's why the Emancipation Proclamation turns these countries against the South, because now it's no longer about states' rights, it's about slavery. Does that make sense? And Lincoln knows this, and that's why he will issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he does. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. The closest that we ever get to actually getting to war with Great Britain, or the Union gets to going to war with Great Britain, is as a result of the Trent Affair And this is actually in 1861, okay? There's a Union warship that is north off the coast of Cuba that will stop a British ship, and on that British ship is a man by the name of James Mason and John Siddell. Both of these are Confederate diplomats that are on board. So the U.S. captain decides to go ahead and board the Trent, which is the British ship, and basically seizes the British ship, the Trent, okay? The guy taking possession of this ship is a guy by the name of Charles Wilkes, okay? He is a relative to John Wilkes Booth, okay? So Charles Wilkes takes aboard the ship, and he actually begins calling it and calling out as it as a Northern victory. However, Great Britain sees this boarding of their ship and capturing of their ship much differently. They see it as an unauthorized seizure that will violate freedom of the seas and neutrality agreements between Great Britain and France, or Great Britain and the Union, sorry. So Great Britain begins demanding an apology as well as a release of the two diplomats, and if they say that if we do not get an apology, we will declare war on the Union. They even go so far as to actually begin preparing for war against the Union by sending additional British troops into Canada. Ultimately, because Lincoln is fearful of having a war on two fronts, he argues that we need to release the diplomats, and on December 26th, he sends William H. Seward, yes, this guy is still relevant, okay, to basically go and talk to the British diplomats and tell them, we are sorry, Wilkes was wrong for boarding your ship, and he gives a formal apology. As far as the North is concerned, they almost look at Lincoln as being like somebody who has no backbone and will not stand up to the British. From the South, they see it as a kind of poetic justice. The British also see it as poetic justice because here we are going and apologizing for seizing their ships. They've done this to us in the past, right? Impressment, same kind of concept. Here we have some of these things repeating themselves in some ways. Despite the fact that there is no official war after the Trent affair, Great Britain becomes an unofficial naval base for the Confederacy. And they will provide the Confederacy with some of those small raider ships that we were talking about, like the CSS Alabama and the CSS Florida, and because quite frankly the Confederate States don't have enough people that are trained as naval men or as sailors, the British will actually provide the Confederacy with sailors to help operate those ships. They were basically commanded by a Confederate officer and then otherwise supplied with British troops. The North will be very upset about this and will actually protest a lot of this British involvement, and quite frankly, these raider ships of the Confederacy were very, very effective. The CSS Alabama was captained by a guy by the name of Raphael Semons, and he is able to capture 62 Northern Union merchant ships, and he's also able to capture and destroy one warship. It is so effective that the Union ships, which are much smaller or much larger and slower than these smaller raider ships, are unable to catch up with it to be able to capture it and or sink it. And so in its time of existence, basically from 1861, it is very effective, and the Union is not able to sink it until June 19th of 1864, so almost the very end of the war, and it is very effective during that time. Because of the cost that the CSS Alabama and the CSS Florida are causing the Union, Charles Francis Adams, another Adams, he is the son of J.Q. Adams, okay? The son of J.Q. Adams. He actually sends Great Britain a bill for the charges and the damages caused by the CSS Alabama. FYI, Great Britain never actually pays that bill. It's more of a symbolic, like, you owe us for these damages more than anything, and it's also kind of a symbolic big middle finger. In 1862 as well, 1863, the British began building two larger, what are called layered rams. They're similar to the CSS Merrimack in size as well as in damage. They had very large caliber guns that were going to be mounted to them, and quite frankly would have been much more dangerous than the CSS Alabama. They would have been able to break through any kind of blockade, and so as a result of that, the North sees these two ships as being a very big threat and potential threat to the Union cause. Ultimately, they will go to Great Britain, and Charles Francis Adams will once again talk to British diplomats and say that if you give these to the Confederacy, there will be like consequences, including the potential of the United States actually going to war against you. When it comes to France, France has a role in all of this as well. Under Napoleon III, France will actually send troops in to conquer Mexico, which is a direct violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which says that we will not allow any European powers to come in and recolonize any part of the Americas. But it ultimately doesn't start off any kind of world war because William H. Seward will actually begin to prepare American troops to go into Mexico in order to drive the French back out of Mexico. But ultimately, France will just simply abandon Mexico in 1867 as a direct result of France's own issues that they're dealing with and also their own financial crisis that they're dealing with at the time. Question? No. You look like you had a
I
question.
had like a deja vu, and I was trying to remember.
Okay. What that deja vu was all about? Okay.
Yeah, it was something.
So ultimately we don't wind up in World War, but we are very, very close to having a World War I long before there was ever a World War I. Okay? Alright, so one of our first major battles is the Battle of Bull Run, also known as Manassas, depending on who you are talking to. If you're talking to the Union, it is the Battle of Bull Run. If you are talking to the Confederacy, it is Manassas. Where is that familiar whatsoever at all, right? Bunker or Breed's Hill. Same kind of concept, okay? But it is the first major general. Initially, the Union will be led by General Winfield Scott. But remember, Winfield Scott is old fuss and feathers. And remember, he's not just old, he is old at this point in time, okay? And so, under the Union forces then, they hope to be able to make a quick victory through Richmond and then be able to drive into the Confederacy. So the Union will be led by General Beauregard and his troops with the support of Winfield Scott's Navy on the outskirts. Beauregard is for the Confederacy, sorry. And so we've got Winfield Scott versus Beauregard with the support of Stonewall Jackson coming in from Virginia, pushing up north to reinforce through the Shenandoah Valley. The American land forces will be led by General McClellan. So here's where we're going to get into why these generals suck, okay? So here's why, okay? By mid-afternoon, the Confederacy is largely able to force the Union to retreat back north again, and despite the fact that early on they had actually made quite a good advances, the Union had. But the reality of it is for the Union is McClellan is a constant planner. He wants everything to go perfectly right and perfectly according to plan. But unfortunately, war is never perfect and things never go perfectly according to plan. But because McClellan is such a planner, he often delays any kind of large mass troop movement or even being able to react to the Confederate reinforcement by Jackson. And so he simply just waits too long and delays the process to a point where he simply cannot have a victory in which he should have. Does that make sense? Okay. And ultimately it is that, as well as the inexperience of the Union troops, that allows the in this very early battle for the Confederates to have this victory. But it is the Battle of Manassas that really show us that it will wind up being a very long and bloody war for the North, or for the Civil War. Okay. Navally, though, we do see a few initial naval victories for the Union. Remember, we have Winfield Scott to begin with. He will step down, and in his place, we will see Ambrose Burnside. Burnside takes off and basically hits different points along the coast, basically taking and moving off, taking and moving off, or hitting and moving off. Farragut also has good success in April of 1862. He is able to capture New Orleans, which is the largest city in the Confederacy. He will use over like these 9-inch artillery guns that are mounted to his ships. When I say 9-inch, like not 9 inches this way, it's like a 9-inch diameter of the artillery gun. Does that make sense? So the rounds are very large in comparison to things that we have had in the past. As a result of his victory at New Orleans, he is able to capture and force the surrender of over 15,000 Confederate soldiers, and it is the most striking victory for the Union thus far. Sea power ultimately will largely be what gives us any kind of victories to begin with. In addition to that, we will also see victories along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, which will eventually allow us to control Tennessee. Louisiana and Tennessee become the first two states, or the only two states actually, to be defeated and brought back into the Union prior to the end of the war. Okay? But ultimately, it's those two things that kind of help us move forward through this process. Okay. Where am I at here in time? Okay. The Union gunboats largely, in order to take the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, they will actually move up the Tennessee through to Alabama. They will then be able to control the Mississippi River, and largely that control of the Mississippi River at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, those victories are led by Ulysses S. Grant. Interestingly enough, Ulysses S. Grant had actually resigned his post in the western frontier in 1845. He had decided to go out and create a life for himself as a civilian rather than working in the military, but as a civilian he sucked. So, because after several failed jobs in the civilian world and several failed attempts at creating his own personal business, he decided, well, I guess I'll re-enlist in the military, and that's why we wind up with Grant as our most capable general ever, and ultimately he becomes president as a direct result of that. But because of his failures, it also makes him much more willing to take risks and much more willing to lose, because he quite frankly has nothing else to go to. He's tried the civilian world, like everyday life of a normal dude, and he sucks at it. So might as well throw everything I have at it at this side, because that's all I know and all I can be successful at. But his decisiveness and his risk-taking, although it allows for a lot of victories on the western side, it also means that he's going to lose a lot of men as a direct result of it. Many of the battles in which he is involved in, he will see lots of his men actually die. In particular, we see at Shiloh, we will see large numbers of individuals die. We have, for the Union, there are over 23,000, almost 24,000 men that die at Shiloh alone under the leadership of Grant. You would think that that would make people not want to follow Grant, but rather instead is the case. Grant was a consummate leader, and he was somebody that was willing to put himself out in front of the lines as well. And as a direct result of that, his men had a lot of respect for him, and then ultimately would follow him into much or any real kind of skirmish that existed. Grant will also take and utilize the gunboats in order to have those victories. So he combines forces of both Army and Navy to have more resounding victories within those western states. Okay? I kind of already talked about Shiloh. In the east, though, on the other side, besides the ability of our naval victories, everything else really at this point is not going so well on the east. On the west, things are moving a little bit better. In particular, in Shiloh, Grant will face Sidney Albert Johnston. Grant only has about 35,000 men in this particular battle, which if you look at the number of men he had, 35,000 and 24,000 almost die. Huge number of his men that die at Shiloh, but he will face Sidney Johnston, and his men he has 40,000 men. The Confederates actually attacked Grant at dawn near a church, and Grant was caught by surprise. But after the end of the first day, Grant has killed over 15,000 Confederates. Ultimately, Johnston is also killed at the Battle of Shiloh, and ultimately in the west, Johnston will be replaced by Beauregard, who up to this point has been on the East Coast fighting alongside General Lee. Lee also then will take greater command as well as a result of Johnston's death. Lee also is a much bolder risk taker. He's able to read the enemy much better than Johnston ever was, but as a result of that, he also becomes a more sticking point for McClellan and makes things difficult for McClellan as well. Let me see if I can find where I need to be now. What? Okay, so then, because of McClellan failing and being fired after the end of the Battle of First Bull Run, okay, in the second Battle of Bull Run, it'll be led by a guy by the name of General Pope, okay? Now, Pope, Lincoln hopes that Pope will be a much more decisive general, and so he puts him in charge of the Union Army near Washington. He will meet with combined forces of Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet, and basically they're able to force the Yankees to retreat once again. McClellan, although he is still around, he's just not in charge of the Union Army at this point in time, and McClellan could have come to Pope's aid. In fact, Pope actually asked for help from McClellan, but once again, McClellan, as the consummate planner, doesn't come to Pope's aid quickly enough, and so Pope will once again see a loss for the Union. The Union will lose approximately 16,000 men as a direct result of the Second Battle of Bull Run, aka Manassas. The Confederates will lose about 9,000 men in that. Lincoln will once again, as a result of the Second Battle of Bull Run, will remove Pope and put in place McClellan as the command of the Army of the Potomac, because Pope sucked. So why not put somebody else in mind? And sometimes people ask, well, why would you put McClellan back in place if he sucked? Like, Lincoln already fired him one time. Why would he put him back in charge a second time around? Well, the reality of it is Lincoln has nobody else. Okay? Grant is beginning to prove himself out on the western frontier, but the West is not settled at this point, and so if Lincoln removes Ulysses S. Grant from the West and brings him to the East, he'll lose the West, only to probably lose the East as well. So he has to keep Ulysses S. Grant in the West until that region is much more secure, which means he has to go to the only person he knows, which happens to be to go to McClellan. Okay. Now, General Lee decides that he wants to go ahead and try to invade Maryland. He believes that if he can invade Maryland and capture Washington, D.C., it will force the United States, the Union, to actually have to negotiate peace. Part of this is because when we're sitting here at 1862, which means we are at midterm election time. Does that make sense? Which means if Lincoln has a continued loss and another decisive loss, and also if Lee is able to victoriously invade Maryland, where the capital is located, it puts the capital at direct threat, which also means that there's probably going to lose a lot of Republicans in Congress, which then means that those individuals, copperheads who are already calling for an end to the war, potentially could have more seats in Congress, and then ultimately could bring the war to an end and allow the Confederacy to just be themselves.
And this warfare is essentially you take the capital and the war is over.
Yes.
Okay.
It's like capture the flag, kind of. It's either that or you wear the other side out. Does that make sense? Okay. And you get rid of their willingness to fight.
So the South's plan was just to try and take the capital rather than just try and defend,
Yes.
and it turns to defending later in the war.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. It goes from let's wear them out to reach a stalemate, take the capital, defend what we have. Does that make sense? So we kind of have three phases for the Confederacy, in a way. But Lincoln now, 1862 then becomes a critical year for the Union. It becomes critical to seeing an overall victory and maintaining the United States. It also becomes a critical year to keep Britain and France out. At the same time, Lincoln is getting more and more pushback against others. And so Lincoln begins to have to change how he is looking at the perspective of how he runs the government as a whole. So on Monday, we are going to take a look at Lincoln.